Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast. This episode has been brought to you by the Wine to Wine Business Forum 2022. This year will mark the 9th edition of the forum to be held on November 7th and 8th of 2022 in Verona, Italy. This year will be an exclusively in-person edition. The main theme of the event will be all-round wine communication. Tickets are on sale now, so for more information, please visit us at winetowine.net.
Thanks for tuning in to Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People on the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm Steve Raye, your host, and this podcast features interviews with the people actually making a difference in the Italian wine market in America, their experiences, challenges, and personal stories. And I'll be adding a practical focus to the conversation based on my 30 years in the business. So if you're interested in not just learning how, but also how else, then this pod is for you. Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People. This is Steve Raye, your host, and I'm pleased to have as a guest this week Dale Stratton. And Dale, you have a couple of different enterprises, so why don't you give us a little background on who you are and what those three things are?
You bet. Steve, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be able to chat with you and your audience members today. So I involved in three different enterprises, and that's probably a good word to use for them. The first one is I'm president of the Wine Market Council, and the Wine Market Council does consumer research on the wine consumer and has done so for well over 25 years. And when I say we do research on the wine consumer, in today's world, that means you're doing research on the beverage alcohol consumer in total, because that's really where the today's consumer is that by and large, they're participating across all three different categories within beverage alcohol. My second enterprise is I work with Azur Associates. We are a group of consultants, private consultants, and we do consulting work in the strategy, financial planning, and route to market, as well as some M&A work located here in Napa, mostly focused on the wine industry, but we do dabble in a couple of other categories. And then the one we're probably going to talk about most today is SipSource, and that is a data product that is put together by the Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America, where we are aggregating depletion data across wine and spirits that gives us an extraordinarily good view of what's happening in the industry, because it really is the only data source that I know of for three-tier that is able to look at the on and off premise. And, on-premise data has always been such a black hole in trying to understand really what's going on in the on-premise. And never has that been more important than the last 2 years, as you know.
Yeah. So give us some perspective about the absence or the lack of actionable data or trustworthy data or useful data in the industry. It seems like while we're a consumer packaged goods, we have nowhere near the kind of access to the information that we need as marketers to figure out what we're doing and what impact it's having. Why is that?
Yeah, and like most things in our industry, it's because of, what was it, the 21st Amendment, or, that when we repealed prohibition.
Oh, I remember
Yeah, you
that
remember
one,
that.
yes.
We were around. And because there are 51 different sets of laws, that has made it challenging. So if I'm selling Tide soap, my product is available everywhere and goes through the same channels. Because we're in the beverage alcohol industry, we have control states, we have liquor store driven states, we have grocery states. So with all of those, that means that there's different routes to market that are really routes to the consumer, which that means it is difficult to get that data and try and aggregate all those data sources together. Also, because about we'll say 15% as just kind of a guidepost. 15% of volume is done in the on-premise. And because the on-premise is not using the UPC code as their driving identifier for product, that means that we're just not able to get a good look at that data through most sources. And that's, again, where I think SipSource comes into play and does a great job of being able to identify what's happening in the on.
Interesting on the percentage there. That number kind of surprised me, but I think the difference is volume versus value. I think on-premise represents a significant larger share of the value, but I was surprised at how relatively low it is in terms of volume.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So explain how SipSource got started, who formed it, what the resources are that you work with, and how the data gets accessed and cleaned and so forth.
You bet. So this came out of some people who were managing data at the major wholesalers in the country. And they really realized that they needed to also look at data that was more macro than theirs. That within looking at their depletion data, they were seeing what was happening for their brands, but they weren't able to look at what was happening for the other distributors. Now, we don't report at brand level data, and that's one of the tenets. We do not look at brand level. We look at category. Subcategory. We can get down by very different countries of origin. It goes in depth, but it does not go to brand. They aggregated that data, and currently we have 13 different wholesalers that are contributing their data. Here this year, we'll probably get that up to pretty close to 16 or 17 wholesalers. So it's very much capturing the 3-tier, what's happening within that.
Is it all 10 of the top 10 that Impact captures, or mostly those?
It's not the top. We don't have all top 10. And we think it's important that we are capturing some of the smaller wholesalers in some places. And certainly the Northeast is a place where you still have a pretty big distributors. And we do have good participation from some Northeast distributors as well. So as we look at that, they hand their data over to VIP, Vermont Information Processing. And most people in the industry know who VIP is. They process most everybody's depletion data. VIP aggregates that data, attributes it, cleans it up, and then puts that into a tool, their software tool called iDig, and we extract the data via that. And anybody can buy access to SipSource data. We put out quarterly reports, or you can sign up for monthly updates as well as to what's happening. That gives you a top line of what's happening in the wine and spirits industries.
And you guys do a good job of trade PR and capturing some of the highlights of that, which we see frequently in the newsletters and the trade magazines and so forth.
Absolutely.
So give us a sample. Well, the first question, it was one of the first things I learned in the industry. There's a huge difference between shipments and depletions. And so for some of our foreign listeners, perhaps you can define that?
You bet. So a shipment is capturing the transaction between the supplier and the wholesaler. So that is what gets landed. That includes imports, of course, as imports land in this country, and then they get shipped off to their various wholesalers.
So it would be from importer sales to distributor is a shipment, as well as a domestic producer sale to a distributor.
That's correct. And then the depletion is the transaction that occurs between the distributor and the retailer or on-premise operator. And that again, there's some variability in that. When we start thinking about reporting out on that data, it's important that you understand how those transactions work. Probably the biggest thing to keep in mind when you're tracking that is days in a month, right? Because
selling days. Yeah,
selling days, right? Because if you start looking at 1 month data, you can really get some probably not accurate data just because the previous year's month might have had 2 fewer selling days. And that has a big impact. So we really, I look at SipSource data and I look at 3-month periods, give me a really good shot of what's happening right now. I always look at 3, 6, and 12 and kind of watch those trends to see what's happening across them, just to make sure that there's no timing anomalies that occur in that data.
So, but you're reporting depletion data as opposed to shipment data.
We are reporting depletion data. That is exactly right. And again, for when we think about where product ends up in the system, especially for the on-premise, that's pretty much capturing what's happening with the consumer, because there's just, there's not a lot of stockpiling happening in the on-premise world.
For cash reasons and accessibility reasons as well.
Yeah, and just space.
Let me digress with one point. There's a term in the industry that a lot of people listening might not be familiar with, and it does impact shipment and depletions, and that's bailment. Can you talk a little bit about how that impacts shipments and depletions and why it's kind of not really one or the other.
Yeah, the limbo of the supply chain, and that is that you can. I have not dealt a lot with bailment, but within bailment and transactions are really what's primarily triggering the recording of transactions, and this is the double-edged sword of our industry because we're so heavily taxed. You need accurate records for the movement of that product. So bailment is simply a place where you're holding the product until it gets shipped out to its next location because you're holding back on paying the taxes on that until it moves to the place where you legally have to pay tax.
So in control states, we see that happening. I know Ohio works that way, but the shipper person, the person who's under the shipment terminology, owns it while it's still in a warehouse. So even though it might have physically shipped, it doesn't count as a shipment nor a depletion until it's moved through to the next level. Anyway, that's just to confuse people more than they already are. And I really don't want to do that.
For imports, that probably does happen a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Right? When you think about, well, for your an import, bailment matters.
Yeah. And also for both of us, we're both, competitors in the consulting industry. And these are things that we have to explain to people. But let's get back to what we were talking about and the importance of planning and the idea of real-time data. One of the issues that a lot of people that I work with have is, they don't get a depletion report from their importer until about 45 days after the end of a given month, which makes it really, really difficult to respond to things in a timely fashion.
Yeah. And I think, and this is also when for us at SipSource, we've approached this from the standpoint that we're not the only tool that you need to understand your business. We're a very good tool to understand your business, but there are other tools out there that can help you depending on what question you're answering to get that understanding and understand that. With SipSource, we have about a 45-day lag period, right? So later this week, I will validate the July ending shipment or depletions and get that out. And that's kind of the way that it is. Now, VIP, if it's just your depletions, they can set you up so that you're getting that in a very, very expedient manner. But also for me, this is where an IRI or a Nielsen data comes into play. They're updating those databases weekly. That is what's going out to the consumer. And you're able to really track what's happening very, very quickly with that scan data. Now, it might be a very different story in the on-premise, so you're not capturing that. You may not be capturing what's happening in your control states or your liquor store states. That is expedient data. And with, 1 week lag time, basically, you're able to understand what's happening with your brand, your items in the marketplace. So by having multiple tools and the scan data is just so good for being able to answer what's happening right now and what are those trends that are occurring almost real time.
As I understand it, then you're able to look at these short-term changes, call them a blip, and then longer-term actual trends. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, and looking at short-term trends can be helpful, but don't overreact to short-term trends. And I think that's one of the things that is very important to understand. If I'm laying out my 3-year plan and trying to understand my 3 or 5-year plan, then I want that longer term data. I need to understand longer term what's happening. If I want to understand how did the brand that I had on ad in X retailer perform, I need that weekly data. I need to understand, right? And realistically, just probably 2 weeks because the ad period will cross 2 weeks. But that is where I need to understand, okay, did my ad generate the sales that I thought that it would? And now I can actually start to see, are my promotions working? Am I getting the lift that I wanted to get off that spend that I had to discount that product?
Okay. So one of the areas that really defines new brands coming into the market is the expectation for distributors of putting, quote unquote, feet on the street, also called brand ambassadors, market managers, a lot of different names for them. But basically, they're people that are under the employ, either subcontracted or directly, of a supplier and working alongside or parallel to the existing distributor sales force. How does SipSource, or how can you use SipSource data to make decisions on brand ambassadors?
Yeah, I think, and to me, that is a great example of an area where you don't want to get caught up in short-term results. This is somebody who, to your point, it's either an employee or it's somebody that I've contracted with. That's going to take time to get results. So for me, when I start thinking about where I focus on that, then I can start to see, is that paying out? Now, one of the difficult things with brand ambassadors and monitoring their effectiveness is not every market is necessarily going to be going after the same thing. Right. And when I think about, your Italian producers, I might have a market that, I'm just not performing. This market has never really caught on with Pinot Grigio, and we need to drive Pinot Grigio. Where I'll go to another market, and it's like, man, Pinot Grigio is so well established in this market. We really need to focus on reds, and we're going to drive reds. So being able to cut that data in a more regional viewpoint is something that can be very, very helpful in doing that. The most important thing in those situations for me, Steve, is understanding what your objectives are on the front end, right? And so many times as I was working in my old supplier days and working with sales and marketing teams, was you could always build a story that showed you were successful.
Oh, that's our little dirty little secret.
Right? If you need a positive story, like I can find it for you. The question is, did you achieve what you were trying to achieve? And that is where you really have to make sure that you've outlined what are you trying to achieve with that program, and then how am I going to measure the success of that? And when you talk about a new product, though, for a new product, that should be pretty clear, because you need to measure distribution. Step one, am I able to get distribution? How am I doing on distribution on that item? And what does that look like?
Italian Wine Podcast, brought to you by Mama Jumbo Shrimp.
Yeah, but the challenge there is distribution that sticks. And so one of the measurements I like to look at is velocity or sell-through or repeat orders at retail, to tell you that you didn't just load in inventory, that the product is actually moving. Let's get back to the regionality. And, there's some good things and bad things about regionality. When we talk about, just use New York as a market, New York really impacts three different states: Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. Yet much of the data that we deal with, that we commonly see, is state-oriented as opposed to regionally oriented. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I think I always, as doing analytic work, I want to get it at the least aggregated level I can, because I know I can aggregate it back up. All right, so if I get it at the municipality level, I can probably make that into state. I can make state into region. I can do that. However, that's not always easy to do. And, for us, and an opportunity for us at SipSource is we're going to roll out I think we're going to have about 7 states where we're able to report at the state level.
Okay.
That's very, very good. That's 43 fewer than we want. But then the other one is doing that at a division level by census division. And that can give you a really good view also as to what's happening within that. An example of that, and still today, if you look at regionally the on-premise recovery, well, the South Atlantic and the South Central census divisions are performing much better than the rest of the country. That's because Florida and Texas really opened early, right? They kind of like, hey, bring it on, come on in. We're just going to open and see what happens. Well, they established that. Now, their growth rates aren't where they were, but they certainly have established a higher run rate compared to where they were in February of 2020 for the on-premise.
Okay, turning to not U.S. region, but country of origin, and give us kind of the hierarchy of the kind of information you're gathering there, both in terms of country of origin, how that impacts varietal, and also the idea of price band.
So within country of origin, we are breaking out every major country. So and major is important to say because you at some point in time you do get down to the all other.
So Bulgaria is not in there, I'm guessing, right?
Bulgaria is not in there. That is correct. All of the major countries of origins are in there. Within that, we can break it down by on and off premise. Within on and off premise, we can look at like for the on premise, dining versus nightclub versus recreation. We can look at grocery versus liquor versus drug versus wholesale club. Wholesale club is another place where there's not a whole lot of data out there. So SipSource can kind of fill you in on that gap as to what's happening with the club stores. And then we do go down to varietal level and looking at the varietal level and table versus sparkling versus other. So desserts, within dessert, you can look at port, sherry, vermouth. Vermouth's kind of a fun story because when we had the shelter in place, vermouth went off the charts, right?
Right. Right. I saw that. Yeah.
As the cocktail culture moved inside. And, I have joked that in like June of 2020, there were probably more households with vermouth in them than there had been since the 1960s.
Now, is that because people are drinking Negronis? That's my favorite drink, but
Yeah, and just martinis as well, old fashions, right? You start thinking about that. By the way, high end Italian vermouth still does pretty well, still growing off a small base, but it's growing. And then we can look at price bands, and within the price bands, we have 7 different price bands within the SipSource data. So under 450 is one of them, 450 to 799, 8 to 1099, 11 to 14.99, 15 to 24.99, 25 to 49, and then 50 plus. So we're able to really break that down very, very in good, accurate buckets as to what's happening with the price bands. It's a little bit different for sparkling because the center of gravity is just a little higher for sparkling. There's just really no sparkling wine, very little sold under $8 anymore. It also tops out a little bit higher. It's over 75 as opposed to over 50.
what I like about that, and I've seen this more in spirits, I think, than in wine, is a lot of times you'll see regular or premium or luxury or ultra, and those are not specific enough that those same terms applied to rum would be very different than those applied to scotch or especially now tequila, right? The upper end of it is dramatically changed. How do yours line up with Nielsen? I know Nielsen has a 9 to 11 category, which crosses the $10 mark.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, they're close, and as we built these price tiers, we tried to keep what the other data reporting tools were using as that so that we could get close. But we really just had to look at where did those kind of price breaks bundle and come about it naturally. And these really were where you saw those price breaks naturally occur. Uh, and when I think about the wine category, we all know what the 450 and under is. Uh, the 450 to 799, we know what those brands are, and they occupy a space. Then it starts to get a little bit cloudier, right, and a little bit different, especially when you start thinking about if I'm a brand that has a Sauvignon Blanc and a Cabernet. Well, my Sauvignon Blanc might be $16.99, and my Cabernet is $24.99 under those same labels. So it does get a little hard to do sometimes, but we tried to consider, that we knew that people who were using this data set would be using other data sets. So how do we at least get them close to each other so that we're not talking apples?
That you can compare and contrast. Yeah. I mean, that's always been a challenge of mine, trying to correlate Nielsen data with some of the other sources we use. Let's turn a little bit to another area, which I don't know if you guys capture it or not. We talk about on-premise, we talk about off-premise, but now there's e-premise. And the whole concept of e-commerce, direct-to-consumer, there's a lot of different words out there to describe it, and they each kind of describe different things. How does SipSource handle stuff that sells over the internet.
Yeah. So anything, when I think about the wine industry, anything that is sold directly from a winery to a consumer, direct to consumer, we don't capture that at all.
That's domestic, which is domestic sales to consumers is the only way that you can bypass the 3-tier system.
Correct.
A lot of people ask me, well, how do I do that? Well, you can't if you're an imported.
Yeah.
So that's what I call DTC and what a lot of other people call DTC, even though DTC can be construed as being something broader.
Yeah, and I think you hit it. And when you start talking about this, you have been in conversations. I have been in conversations where I hear people using the same terms, and they're talking about wildly different things.
Yes.
Right. And DTC, there's a portion of DTC that is e-commerce. It is digitally enabled. But really what we're seeing and the growth on this is really, to me, the e-commerce portion of brick and mortar retailers. So a Total Wine and More, they're doing a substantial amount of business that is e-commerce related. Obviously, Drizzly has done very, very well in this space. All of that data is captured by SipSource. Now, like that Drizzly transaction, that's not going to be captured as an e-commerce transaction. That depletion goes to that independent proprietor who owns that store. It's just another depletion. We capture it within SipSource, but we don't know if it went e-commerce or not. Okay. Now, with some other ones where they are identifying that, we can see some e-commerce. And there are some pure play e-commerce retailers out there, right? GoPuff was until they started buying brick and mortar stores.
Now they own BevMo. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so within that, we're capturing within SipSource, we're capturing that data. We're just not always able, anything that goes through the 3-tier, we're capturing the transaction. It's reported in the data. We just may not be able to break it out as being e-commerce.
And so I've done a bunch of interviews with some other people involved in the e-commerce side where you can get down to the nitty gritty, but I like to differentiate things by inter and intra-state sales by a retailer to a consumer. So it may be to a consumer in your own state, which you can do in New York State, or to a separate state, which you can't go from New York and out. And most people would say you can't do that in Florida as well. But the other variation is what we call TPF, third-party facilitators. And that's where Drizzly and some of these others fit in, that they don't necessarily take ownership of the product. They're just facilitating the sale between the retailer and the consumer. It's another confusing aspect of this, and it makes it a lot harder to measure the impact of online sales.
To me, that goes back to kind of where we started on this is within our industry, there's a lot of things that are just hard to get information on. Right? That's one of them. And for us, because it's an independent liquor store who purchased the product, right? So they bought that from a wholesaler. We have that depletion, but they're not doing anything necessarily to designate what went out the front door and what went out via a Drizzly delivery person or a third-party provider.
And yet, we've all been working, you and I have been working in this for many decades, and we've managed our way through, and we're getting better and better information, better and better insight, and more timely information. SipSource is one of the providers of that. So kudos to you and your team for putting all that together.
It's good. Yeah, it has been helpful. And, for me, I think that, and I think there's a number of things that we always believed to be true. We are able now to validate that they are true and understand the magnitude of that truth. And, for me, that's when you start thinking about different categories and their reliance on-premise. And, so for vermouth was very reliant on the on-premise. Sake, very reliant on the on-premise. In the sparkling world, champagne, high degree of that product is sold through the on-premise, a very high degree. You mentioned earlier on the spirit side, tequila, right? I always have said that name another drink, another cocktail that you go into a restaurant and order by the pitcher. Margaritas.
God bless tequila.
God bless tequila. So when you start thinking about that, really now understanding the magnitude of how important the on-premise is for those products, low end sparkling wine, the bottomless mimosa promotions, the sparkling wine brunch where they're pouring it as part of your brunch. Those things are going through a lot of product in this country. And now to understand the magnitude of the below $8, you know what? On-premise is pretty. If you have an under $8 sparkling wine, the on-premise is very important to that.
Boy, and that's a tough one to do, certainly by the traditional method and even by the Charmat bulk.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's kind of bring this thing around. I like to end each interview with a question. Out of all the things that we've discussed, what's the big takeaway for listeners, for people who are trying to understand the U.S. market and gain some insights into the U.S. market? And most of our listeners are the trade. Is there one thing that we talked about that they can kind of take away and put to use immediately?
Yeah, to me, it's get the right tool to understand the business that you're going after and get the right data sources that can help you answer the questions that you need and that can monitor your success rate along the way. And I think SipSource is a very, very good tool to do those. It's not the only tool, but we're able now to use, as you said, we're able to get better and more accurate data. It's more important now to use that data and apply that data to be successful than it ever has. The retailer is more sophisticated than they've ever been. They're only going to get more sophisticated. You know, in the on-premise, we have definitely seen a reduction in the number of items carried. On-premise is still a difficult channel to survive in. And those operators are doing everything they can, and they're using information. They're using data. You need to show up with that data as well.
That's part of the value add as a supplier that you can bring to the party is to, I've always been a believer in people don't want to buy your products. They want to buy your products so that they can sell drinks to consumers and make money at it. Let's not lose focus on what we're doing here. Having a wonderful product is not the end goal here. The end goal is to make people happy and come back and tell their friends about it. And so the intermediary, the retailer in the off-premise and the on-premise account benefit. We tend to lose sight of that, but I think that's important. Okay, SipSource. If people want to know more about it, what's the URL?
www.sipsource.com.
Well, that makes that easy. Okay, and if people want to reach out to you directly and engage in a conversation, would you be kind enough to share your email address?
Absolutely. Dale.Stratton@Azur-Associates.com.
Dale Stratton, thank you very much for being my guest. It's always enjoyable to talk to you and see what you guys are doing. I think we're all kind of part and parcel of the same thing as moving this whole thing forward. I'd like to share the story. A friend of mine once told me, when we get asked this all the time, what's the best bottle of wine or what's the best bottle of tequila? And the answer is the one I just sold. That's what we're in the business all about, is moving product. So thank you much for sharing your time with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Look forward to chatting with you again soon.
And hopefully we'll see each other at WSWA. It looks like that's going to happen this year, right?
It's going to happen. That's right. A convention is going to occur. So it's going to be, and I think they're doing a great job. It's going to be a new format.
Yeah, so information on that would be at WSWA.org, and it's called the annual convention. It's going to take place in Florida this year, and I believe it's April 2nd through 5th, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. You must have recently purchased your ticket.
All right. Once again, Dale, thank you very much for joining us. And for those of our listeners, tune in next week, and we'll have another very interesting conversation with someone from the beverage alcohol industry in the United States on Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People. This is Steve Raye saying goodbye until next week.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode brought to you by the Wine to Wine Business Forum 2022. This year will mark the 9th edition of the forum, to be held on November 7th and 8th, 2022 in Verona, Italy. Remember, tickets are on sale now, so for more information, please visit us at winetowine.net. Hi guys. I'm Joy Livingston, and I am the producer of the Italian Wine Podcast. Thank you for listening. We are the only wine podcast that has been doing a daily show since the pandemic began. This is a labor of love, and we are committed to bringing you free content every day. Of course, this takes time and effort, not to mention the cost of equipment, production, and editing. We would be grateful for your donations, suggestions, requests, and ideas. For more information on how to get in touch, go to ItalianWinePodcast.com.